or sponsors.
Welcome to the Timeshare Information Network, where we cover all things timeshare. Whether you've owned a timeshare for years, just purchased one, or are thinking about becoming an owner, this program is for you. Now here's your moderator and co-host, Lisa Ann Schreier, the Timeshare Crusader.
Hello, and welcome to the Timeshare Information Network. I am Lisa Ann Schreier, the Timeshare Crusader, and with me is my co-host, Andrew Meyer of the Finn Law Group. On our last show, Andy and I were discussing various ways of getting out of a timeshare, which led to the various documents that are generated when purchasing a timeshare. If any of you have purchased a timeshare, you know that there are a lot of documents. So not only are there a lot of documents, but we realize that there's a lot of questions about the documents that are generated, including the much talked about public offering statement, also referred to as the POS. So Andy, if it's okay with you, let's devote today's show to various documents associated with the purchase of a timeshare. And we also have a few questions from our listeners about those documents.
Sounds great, Lisa. Yeah, unfortunately, the timeshare transaction is very document intensive. I like to tell people that the timeshare product is oftentimes, I think, more complicated than buying a home. Certainly have as many documents to sign as you do at a typical home closing, that's for sure. Lots to talk about here.
Which is amazing considering that the vast majority of people buy a timeshare after a 2, 3, 4 hour high-pressure sales presentation, much the opposite way that most rational people would buy a house. So it's just amazing to me that it's still like this. So as anyone who has purchased a timeshare knows all too well, the closing or the verification process can sometimes take longer than the actual sales pitch. As an aside, I had some friends in from out of town last week who had purchased a timeshare from me when I was still a salesperson 22 years previously. Yes, they still keep in touch with me. Yes, they take me to dinner every time they're in. And they decided to upgrade. And they were in the closing office for 4 hours. That's 4 hours after the initial sales presentation. They were very confused. And the resorts, they seem to spit out a ton of paperwork, much of which, as Andy has alluded to, requires the buyer's signature. So, Andy, can you give us, our listeners, a basic understanding of what paperwork is involved when you purchase a timeshare? And let's focus first on the non-financial stuff. So let's assume somebody's paying cash or there's no financing involved. We can certainly talk about the financial aspect of it later. But what can buyers expect paper-wise when they're buying a timeshare?
Sure, Lisa. So there's a lot even outside of the financial side. Financial side typically meaning a mortgage, or it could be a mortgage and an application for third-party credit, like a new credit card. Sometimes that happens at the timeshare closing table. So those all have their own documents, and those are just on that side are quite complicated. But on the non-financial side, you talked about it earlier, there's going to be the public offering statement. And this goes to something we've talked about in prior shows, that timeshare is really based, when you think about it legally, on the concept of condominium. So we all know about buying a real estate and a house, and you get a deed, and you own the land, and you own the house on the land. But condominium, of course, is a little bit of a variation on that. You buy a particular unit. You don't actually own any land necessarily, although you may own a piece of the common elements. So there's a whole body of law that is developed on the condominium side, and timeshare is derived from that. So the idea is that now you don't even own a unit, but you might own a week and the right to use a particular unit for a week. And of course, as you know, Lisa, over the years, timeshare has gotten even more complicated, and now oftentimes You don't even own that much. You might only own an interest in a trust, or you may only own points. So the documents you're going to be reviewing and signing at the timeshare sales transaction are going to be all of those associated with those various pieces of the puzzle. There may be a deed you're signing. There's going to be documents given to you disclosing the rights and responsibilities as a timeshare owner with respect to the common elements, and that's really where the public offering statement comes in, which is, again, a very condominium-like document. If you're getting a trust, interest in a trust, there'll be trust documents, and you may be.
Eddie, let me stop you for a quick second, if you don't mind. When you say it's a trust, can you give us a basic legal definition of the difference between owning a timeshare that is yours per se and one that is held in trust? What does that mean?
Right. So we think about trust a lot of times in the estate planning context. People will create a living trust. So the idea is that you don't actually own the asset. A trust, a fictitious entity called the trust, owns the asset. And then there'll be a trustee whose job it is to make sure that the asset that the trust owns is properly cared for, and you own a beneficial interest in the trust. And there's all kinds of reasons why you could separate those ideas of having an interest in a trust, being a beneficial user of trust property, versus being the trustee, versus being the trust itself, which holds the property. There can be tax implications and tax reasons. There can be inheritance reasons. Here in the timeshare context, it oftentimes makes it easier for developers to sell the product because they're not actually giving you a deed. They're only giving you a trust instrument. It can be easier for the timeshare developer to take the interest back if you don't perform. Oftentimes, all they have to do is cancel your beneficial interest, and that doesn't necessarily require judicial intervention. So a trust is a fictitious legal entity that exists to hold the ownership, and you, the consumer, in this context, would have a beneficial interest in the trust. But as you can imagine, Lisa, from just talking about these ideas, documenting them can be quite lengthy, and the documents you're given to examine these items can be very lengthy. They have to describe this relationship, who the trustee is, what the trust's responsibilities are going to be, what your rights and obligations as a trust member are. And this is all handed to you in one big package. You'll have to sign a document acknowledging that you received it.
It's a lot to take in even in this conversation. I can't imagine going through it in a closing office after being through a high-pressure sales pitch. Now, when you talk about a trust, I want to stay on this for 1 second, if you don't mind. Is there an advantage or a disadvantage to the purchaser if they buy something that's held in trust? Because from the way you were explaining it, it sounds to me that the trustee is pretty much in charge of everything. So if the trustee is the developer, am I correct in assuming that it favors the developer even more than a standard deed?
So it gets very complicated quickly, but I'll say it this way. If you own what we like to call a legacy timeshare interest, and that would be a deeded unit and week at typically a small resort somewhere, you will have a piece of paper somewhere amongst the documents you were given that is also recorded in the public records, and that shows you are an owner of that unit and week. And that's probably the best you can hope for as far as the most rights you would receive in a timeshare transaction. And from that being the most rights that a consumer would have, you start going down the continuum to the least rights the consumer will have. And a trust is probably closer to the other end of the spectrum with the fewer rights that the consumer will have. Because, as you're saying, Lisa, a lot of those rights and benefits are retained by the trust and the trustee. And your usage of that timeshare is governed by the trust documents. And in the middle, perhaps somewhere, in the middle somewhere, Lisa, is this idea of points. A lot of folks buy a unit a week, and then they give it back to the developer in exchange for participation in points programs. And that's got its own pluses and minuses. So it gets rapidly complicated in all these documents.
Yes, it definitely sounds like it. And am I correct in assuming that you get all these documents, the ones you need to sign and the ones that might be informational in nature, Am I correct in assuming that the purchaser must be given all those forms before the sale is considered finalized or done, which would impact, if that's the correct terminology, which would then impact when your legal right of rescission begins?
So that's absolutely correct. And I will say that in my experience, which is only derivative, that is through clients, it does seem that developers are quite keen on giving you all those documents as soon as you leave the transaction. Now, how they give them to you can differ, and we'll be talking about that in a little bit later. But that's right; they need to give you all the disclosures, and there's quite a few that are dictated by law as to what you have to be given. They're going to want to give them all to you at one time, and before you leave that sales table. And the idea behind that then is that your rescissionary period begins to run, as you mentioned, Lisa. In Florida, you get 10 days to rescind the transaction. And the idea is you'll take those documents and you'll rush to your lawyer the next day, and you'll have your lawyer review them with you carefully in quite a hurry, and that way you'll fully understand all the rights and obligations that you've undertaken within that 10-day period. That's the theory.
Right, because
Practice,
everyone's going
right.
to call their attorney when they're on vacation in Florida. Right, yeah, sarcasm intended. And regarding the rescission rate, the rescission time in Florida, rather, you mentioned 10 days. Is it 10 calendar days or 10 business days?
Oh, well, that's 10 days. It's 10. You need to start counting those 10 days from when you leave that transaction table. Is what you need to do. You need to act rapidly. It's not a lot of time. It's not a lot of time.
No, definitely.
And of course, other states.
And I understand the rescission laws in other states is significantly less than 10 days. Florida seems to have one of the longest ones. If I'm not mistaken, there are some states who have only a 3-day right of rescission. Am I correct?
Right. That's right. Yes. So it's not a time period to be trifled with. And we've had circumstances where people will send that letter, just the one day outside the window, and the resort does not honor it because they don't have to. So it's a hard deadline. It's not negotiable really. So you got to move quickly if you're going to act within the rescissionary period.
Yeah, definitely something for people to keep in mind. When we return to the Timeshare Information Network, we're going to be answering some of your calls. And we're also going to be discussing the very, very important pending legislation in Florida regarding this public offering statement that we've talked so much about. We'll be right back.
If a tree falls in the woods and no one is around to hear it, does it make a sound? Have you ever felt that your voice goes unheard? And you think that you can make a difference if only someone would listen. It's time for women in business to have a place to step into your power, a platform to embrace your hopes, dreams, and your visions, a voice to heal and restore. Your voice can make a difference. We have a platform you deserve to share your story and let your voice be heard. Be kind to yourself. Give yourself the chance to be heard and shine bright. Contact New Dawn Media by texting CAFE to 55312. That's CAFE to 55312. Or call us at 866-224-5422. Your voice can make a difference.
Welcome back to the Timeshare Information Network. As a reminder, the Timeshare Information Network airs live every other Monday at 6:30 p.m. in South Florida on 95.3, 96.9, 1470, and on WWNN Radio on the Beasley Network. Of course, you can listen in from anywhere by accessing those stations online. If you missed anything or want to listen again, we're also available as a podcast on your favorite podcast platform. Just look for the Timeshare Information Network. And now, back to your moderator and co-host, Lisa Ann Schreier.
Welcome back to the Timeshare Information Network. I am Lisa Ann Schreier, the Timeshare Crusader, and with me is attorney and managing partner Andy Meyer of the Finn Law Group. Andy, are you ready for some questions that came in after our last program?
Absolutely. Always great to hear from our listeners.
Great. Our first question comes from Mark in Minnetonka, Minnesota. He wants to know, is the buyer supposed to get the same paperwork if they buy a timeshare from someone else other than the developer? I guess Mark is asking if you buy a quote-unquote new timeshare from the developer versus a quote-unquote used timeshare from an individual or a selling platform, is the paperwork the same?
Well, so that's an interesting question, and it's as with many things in this area, not easy to answer. So when you're at the transaction table buying, as you say, Lisa, quote, new timeshare, to the extent such a thing exists, the developer is going to give you a lot of documents that are specific to their own needs. And they're also going to give you these documents to make sure that they, the developer, can prove that they gave you all the information that they think they're supposed to give you. So, for example, you're going to get a document where you're going to disclaim reliance on any oral statements made to you by the salesperson, and you're going to acknowledge all kinds of statements that may be contrary to what you heard during the sales presentation. You're going to put your initials by those. You're not going to get a document like that on a resale in the resale market. You should be getting a copy of the public offering statement. That's an integral part of what you're purchasing. It tells you a whole bunch about what it is you're buying, but you're probably not going to get that in a resale. The documents that we typically see in a resale are pretty sparse. That's not that they should be that way. That you should be getting the full, the full set of disclosure documents that you get, but especially if you're dealing with an individual who's selling to you perhaps from eBay or some other kind of online site, doubtful that you'll get all those documents. One way to protect yourself in that instance is to only deal with reputable real estate brokers. There are a few out there that will specialize in resale of timeshare interests, and by having a real estate professional or an attorney helping you, you can be sure you get all the disclosure documents you should be getting.
Absolutely. And would I be correct? I generally don't like large-scale generalizations, but is it a fair statement to say do not buy a, again, quote-unquote, used timeshare unless you're getting the public offering statement? Is that fair?
Yes, I mean it's right, Lisa. I mean it's really difficult because there's so many different ways the timeshare product can be structured. So and there's so many different rules that are developer specific on how to properly, if you can't even properly transfer a timeshare interest to another third party. So, for instance, let's say you own a beneficial trust interest. You've got to make sure that that trust interest is conveyed to you, the buyer, in a manner that's consistent with the trust documents. So you'd have to see those and make sure that it's being conveyed to you in a way that will be legally binding. And there may be documents that the trust or the resort required to be completed in order to make that transaction stick, and that would be for the protection of the seller and the buyer. So it's a tricky area. Absolutely, I would say. Even more generally, you don't want to buy a quote used timeshare without making sure you're getting everything you need to understand what you would be buying. So you would have to
absolutely, and I think one of the benefits,
yes,
in addition to the price, of course, is if you're dealing with a quote unquote again used timeshare, you generally are not making this decision in haste, so you would have time to ask questions and to contact an attorney if necessary. So that's a really good point. This is a great question from Jessie in Indianapolis. She said, "Hi, I purchased a timeshare 2 years ago on vacation, and when we were signing the paperwork, the person going over everything said that she was taping everything. Is this legal, and was I supposed to get a copy of this recording?"
So I would say first that it is not surprising that final piece of the transaction is being recorded. Sometimes it's even video recorded. The question of is it legal, that's going to depend on the state where the transaction is occurring. Here in Florida, recordings are governed by what we call a two-party consent scheme. So that means both sides have to consent to the recording, and I am almost confident, I mean, as much as a lawyer can say, that the developer will have a document in the package of things you've signed that gives the developer the right to record you in that final stage. I can't imagine a developer in Florida not having that consent absolutely signed by you. So I'm going to go on a limb and say it's legal, and no, you're not going to get a copy of it. They're going to hold on to it for some period of time. Some developers hold on to them longer than others. Some don't hold on to them very, very long at all. But no, they're not going to give that to you. That's definitely not going to happen.
Wow. The more we delve into this, the more it becomes very apparent that this is not something that you should enter into on a whim. Our last question today, before I want to save time for this pending legislation, we also heard from Sandy in Navarre in Florida. And she asked, I bought timeshare about 2 years ago, and I'm just starting to understand how to use it. But when I did the closing, I signed most everything they gave me on a tablet, not on an actual piece of paper. Should I have insisted on an actual physical copy of everything? And I think, Andy, if I'm correct, this dovetails quite nicely into our discussion about the pending legislation in Florida.
Absolutely, it does, Lisa. That's right. So I don't think that it necessarily is a requirement for you to get everything on paper in this point. I mean, think about when you go to the cell phone store to buy a new cell phone and you sign up for cell coverage, they give you this incredibly lengthy contract on a little tiny credit card reader, and you're supposed to scan through it and read it. And of course, you know, no human can do that. A tablet's probably better than that. Certainly something you can take home in that 10-day period and review the documents at your leisure if you're inclined to do so. So a tablet doesn't bother me. You know, what gets a little bit trickier is if they give you a thumb drive. That's happened before, or a CD-ROM, something that you have to use your own computer to use, or maybe you lose it, you misplace it. You know, it's probably a little bit less likely that you're going to misplace a whole giant stack of papers, but I don't know. Certainly the environmentalists would be glad that we use up less paper.
True, absolutely. So these are great questions from our listeners. Remember, we want to hear from you. So if you have a question, you can email me at lisa@theti.net. That's lisa@theti.net. Andy, before we go in our last few minutes, I mentioned that there's a bill pending in the Florida legislature that, among other things, would allow developers to put the public offering statement on a CD, as well as force the purchaser to order it if they wanted to read it. Is this, as I suspect, a way of potentially keeping information from the consumer that may affect their decision to keep or cancel the timeshare during the rescission period? I know this is a big question and we only have a few minutes, but I'd love your thoughts on this.
Right. So first to say, the way it works at present is
2 minutes.
that the Florida legislature lets the Florida Department of Professional Business and Professional Regulation, DBPR, is in charge of governing and issuing regulations as to how the timeshare developer is to deliver the required documents to you. So it's at a regulatory level at this point. And really, the regulatory agency has been allowing timeshare developers to give people CDs or thumb drives. They've even blessed a piece of paper that has a website address for you to go to. So that's really, in my mind, a difficult one. You got to go to a web browser and you go to a page that could change.
Absolutely.
So, but what I think this bill is doing is it would codify in law and take away from the agency this notion that these alternative forms of disclosure, not just paper, but a CD or even a website or whatever, that those would be legal and would take away from the consumer an argument that they weren't given an adequate disclosure. And as a consumer, advocate and a lawyer for consumers, not really a big fan of this proposal. I think people should be given a tablet, as we were talking about earlier, or the papers, something that can itself show you what you're being given. not something that you yourself have to now go plug into a computer or keep hold of, or even worse, order. So not necessarily a reform, I think, it's great for consumers, no, Lisa, but it's certainly something that the timeshare industry is proposing at present.
Absolutely.
Just got to be careful.
We'll definitely be making, keeping our eyes on this pending legislation and let our listeners know what's happening. That's it for this episode of the Timeshare Information Network. If you have questions, concerns, or suggestions for a future show, we want to hear from you. You can email me at lisa@theti.net. That's lisa@theti.net. For Andy Meyer and myself, Lisa Ann Schreier, thanks for joining us. And remember to avoid anyone who uses the words free, perfect, always, and never.
You've been listening to the Timeshare Information Network. The Timeshare Information Network airs live every other Monday at 6:30 p.m. in South Florida on 95.3, 96.9, 1470, and on WWNN Radio on the Beasley Network. We're also available as a podcast on your favorite podcast platform. Just look for the Timeshare Information Network. We'll see you next time on the Timeshare Information Network.
The opinions